The year is 178 AD. On the frozen banks of the Danube River, surrounded by the screams of dying soldiers and the smoke of burning villages, the most powerful man in the world sits alone in his tent. His name is Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, commander of the greatest military machine in human history, ruler over 60 million souls. But tonight, he's not writing battle plans or imperial decrees. He's writing to himself. By flickering candlelight, his weathered hands move across papyrus, recording thoughts never meant for any other eyes. Private confessions, desperate prayers, questions that would shake the foundations of an empire if anyone knew their emperor was asking them. Quote, "How much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does." These are the secret journals of Marcus Aurelius, the hidden diary of a man who held absolute power, yet felt utterly powerless. What you're about to discover will change how you see leadership, suffering, and the human condition itself. Because these weren't the polished writings of a philosopher. They were the raw, unfiltered thoughts of a man trying not to break under the weight of the world. And for nearly 1800 years, they remained his most closely guarded secret. Until today. To understand why Marcus Aurelius turned to this diary, you need to understand the suffocating reality of being Rome's emperor at its peak. Picture this. It's 161 AD. The Roman Empire stretches from Scotland to Arabia, 2 million square miles under one man's authority. Marcus Aurelius didn't want this throne. He was a scholar at heart, a philosopher who dreamed of quiet libraries and peaceful contemplation. But fate had other plans. He was groomed for power for 23 years by his adoptive father, Emperor Antoninus Pius. When Antoninus died in 161, Marcus became emperor of the known world. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that every decision you make affects 60 million people. Every mistake could topple civilization. The Antonine dynasty had given Rome nearly a century of peace, the Pax Romana. The empire was wealthy, stable, seemingly invincible. But Marcus was about to learn that empires, like men, are fragile things. And the higher you climb, the farther you have to fall. He inherited the job, but immediately inherited a crisis. 162 AD, the Parthian Empire attacks Roman territory. The eastern frontier, stable for decades, is now a war zone. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher who preferred books to battles, suddenly found himself commanding the greatest military crisis in a generation. His co-emperor, Lucius Verus, led the Eastern campaign. The war lasted 4 brutal years, but victory came with a price no one saw coming. The returning soldiers brought more than just captured territories. They brought death itself. In 1665 AD, a massive plague, possibly smallpox, began sweeping through the empire. It would eventually kill an estimated 5 to 10 million Roman citizens, maybe 10% of the total population. It was called the Antonine Plague. To those who lived through it, it was the end of the world. Picture the horror, the odor of death lingering, cities emptying, trade routes abandoned, the very foundations of Roman civilization crumbling as bodies piled in the streets. And at the center of this catastrophe sat Marcus Aurelius, pausing, watching helplessly. His co-emperor, Lucius Verus, died, likely from the plague, in 1669, leaving Marcus to rule alone during the darkest period in Roman history. But the plague was just the beginning. As disease weakened the borders, Germanic tribes saw their opportunity. The Marcomanni, Quadi, and others began pressing against Rome's northern frontier. By 1670 AD, Marcus Aurelius, the reluctant warrior, found himself leading armies into battle along the Danube River, fighting a war that would consume the final decade of his life. This is where our story truly begins, because it was here, in the frozen wilderness of modern-day Austria and Czech Republic, surrounded by death and destruction, that Marcus began writing his secret journals. Not propaganda, not philosophy for public consumption, just one man talking to himself, trying to make sense of a world that seemed determined to destroy everything he held dear. Marcus Aurelius had been taught that emperors were gods among men. Reality taught him something different. In his tent beside the Danube, as barbarian war cries echoed through the night and plague ravaged his people, Marcus faced a truth few leaders ever acknowledge. Power is not freedom. It's the ultimate prison. He struggled with impossible choices. How do you balance mercy with justice? How do you maintain your humanity while ordering thousands to their deaths? How do you stay true to your philosophical principles while wielding the sword of absolute authority? His personal life was falling apart. He lost multiple sons and daughters to disease. His wife, Faustina the Younger, was a target of nasty public rumors. All of this added layers of isolation to his lonely existence. The man who held absolute power felt utterly powerless. He was desperately trying to reconcile his philosophy with his political reality. These weren't abstract questions. They were daily choices that threatened to tear his soul apart. Despite his immense personal frailty, he displayed resilience and selflessness, even selling his imperial possessions to fund military campaigns instead of taxing the struggling populace. But what did it cost him personally? That's what he explored in his private writings. Late at night, he would take up his stylus and write, not to history, just to himself. Quote, "What brings no benefit to the hive can bring none to the bee," he wrote, trying to convince himself his suffering served a greater purpose. But doubt crept in. Page after page of doubt, fear, and desperate attempts at self-encouragement. This was the beginning of what we now call meditations. But Marcus never titled it that. He called it ta is e hauton, in Greek, things unto himself. A conversation between Marcus the man and Marcus the emperor. A dialogue between his philosophical ideals and his lived reality. A secret journal that was about to become his lifeline. If you're finding strength in Marcus's story, hit the like button so this wisdom can reach more people. And if you've ever felt the pressure of leading a team, a family, or just your own life, leave a comment below and tell me your favorite quote from Meditations. I'll be reading them.
170 AD, the First Marcomannic War. Marcus Aurelius stands on a hill, overlooking the horrific battlefield. The clash of metal, the screams of the dying. But inside his head, there's a voice. Calm, steady, speaking truths that cut through the chaos. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. This wasn't Marcus's voice. It belonged to a man he never met. A former slave who had died decades before Marcus was even born. His name was Epictetus, and somehow his teachings were about to save the Emperor of Rome. Think about the irony. The most powerful man in the world, finding guidance from the writings of a slave. A man who had nothing, teaching wisdom to a man who had everything. But that's what Stoicism offered, a philosophy that transcended social status. Epictetus taught that we can't control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond. That external circumstances, wealth, power, even pain and death are meaningless compared to our internal state of mind. For Marcus, struggling with the weight of empire, these ideas became a revelation. That's when he started writing more deliberately. Not just random thoughts, but systematic self-examination based on Stoic principles. The journal was his Stoic practice, a way of training his mind to find peace amidst chaos. Night after night, he wrote raw, honest self-examination. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one, he wrote. The words as much a command to himself as a confession of failure. The best revenge is not to be like your enemy, he reminded himself when dealing with treacherous allies. Loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight, he whispered to himself as he watched friends die. This was more than journaling. This was psychological warfare against despair itself. He was using self-reflection not just to understand his thoughts, but to reshape them, to build mental resilience that could withstand any external pressure. And slowly, something miraculous began to happen. The writings that started as desperate cries for help began to transform into something else: emphasis, wisdom, strength, a philosophy refined in the crucible of absolute power. As the Marcomannic War began to draw to a close, Emperor Marcus Aurelius was putting the finishing touches on the journal we call the Meditations. But he had no idea his private conversations with himself would one day become a public treasure. What Marcus Aurelius discovered wasn't just a coping mechanism. It was a technology of the mind, a systematic method for building psychological resilience that modern science is only now understanding. Let me show you exactly how it worked and how you can use the same techniques today. The core of Marcus's practice was cognitive reframing, consciously changing how you think about events to change how you feel about them. When faced with betrayal, he wrote, "Whenever you want to cheer yourself, consider the good qualities of your companions." He forced himself to redirect attention away from their failure and toward their virtues. When overwhelmed, he reminded himself, confine yourself to the present. Don't try to solve every problem at once. Focus on what's immediately in front of you. This wasn't empty positive thinking, it was systematic mental training. Here's how you can apply his method. First, the evening review. Every night, Marcus would examine the day, not to judge, but to learn. What went well? How did I respond to challenges? The key, he focused on his responses, not the events, because that's what he could control. Try this. Before bed, spend 5 minutes writing about your day, but analyze how you reacted and what you learned. Second, morning preparation. Marcus wrote in the morning to prepare himself mentally. He reminded himself of Stoic principles and visualized challenges. Begin each day by telling yourself, "Today I shall be meeting with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness." This wasn't empty positive thinking. It was mental inoculation. By expecting difficulties, he was less likely to be thrown off balance when they occurred. Try this. Spend your first few minutes writing about how you want to approach the day. What principles will guide your decisions? Third, the view from above. When overwhelmed, Marcus would mentally zoom out, imagining himself from the perspective of cosmic time. Remember how brief life is, how vast the universe. What is grief but an opinion? This technique, psychological distancing, helps reduce emotional reactivity. Try this. When facing stress, write about the problem as if you're viewing it years in the future. How important will it seem then? The goal wasn't to eliminate difficult emotions, it was to prevent them from controlling your actions. Marcus still felt grief and frustration, but he learned to respond to these feelings with wisdom, rather than reacting impulsively. Marcus faced challenges that feel shockingly familiar today: a global pandemic, political division, economic uncertainty, environmental crises, the feeling that the world is spinning out of control. His secret journals offer a blueprint for maintaining sanity and effectiveness when everything around you seems to be falling apart. Focus on process, not outcomes. Marcus couldn't control whether Rome survived the plague, but he could control how he prepared for meetings, how he treated subordinates, how he made decisions. You can commit injustice by doing nothing, he wrote. Leadership requires action, even in uncertain times. Modern leaders often paralyze themselves by focusing on outcomes they can't guarantee. Marcus teaches us to focus on the process, doing the work with integrity, regardless of results. Accept what you cannot change, one of his most quoted lines. Confine yourself to the present. Don't waste mental energy on things beyond your control. This isn't passive acceptance, it's strategic focus. By not fighting unchangeable realities, you conserve energy for where you can actually make a difference. Find meaning in service. He repeatedly reminded himself that his suffering served a greater purpose, protecting civilization itself. What brings no benefit to the hive can bring none to the bee. Individual sacrifice becomes bearable when it serves something larger than yourself. Here's the most extraordinary part of this story. Marcus Aurelius's meditations were never meant for public eyes. Think about that for a moment. The most influential book on leadership and resilience in human history was never supposed to be read by anyone except its author. They were literally just one man talking to himself.
And that's exactly what makes them so powerful. When he wrote, "You have power over your mind," he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was reminding himself of a truth he desperately needed to hear in that moment. The authenticity in these pages is breathtaking. There's no performance here, no artificial wisdom, just raw, honest human struggle elevated by philosophical insight. This creates an intimacy between Marcus and his readers that most authors can't achieve. When you read the Meditations, you're not listening to a lecture, you're eavesdropping on a conversation between a man and his highest self. And because these thoughts were never filtered through public expectations, they maintain a purity that makes them timeless. He didn't need to worry about political implications. He was just trying to figure out how to be a good person in impossible circumstances. That's why his insights are battlefield philosophy, ideas that had to work under the worst possible conditions, or they were discarded. But here's the miracle. Somehow, these private reflections survived. Marcus died in 180 AD. His son, Commodus, one of Rome's worst emperors, inherited the throne. The manuscripts could easily have been lost or destroyed in the chaos that followed. Instead, they were preserved, copied by scribes, translated, eventually distributed around the world. It's almost as if the universe conspired to ensure that Marcus's private wisdom would become public treasure.
Today, 1800 years later, his secret diary continues to influence leaders, artists, athletes, and everyday people struggling with their own versions of plague, war, and personal loss. All because one man had the discipline to write honestly to himself during the darkest period of his life. We're about to explore the man behind the wisdom, Epictetus. But first, if you haven't already, take a second to subscribe and ring the notification bell. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss our next deep dive into history's most powerful ideas. Now, back to the Danube. As Marcus Aurelius lay dying in 180 AD, did he know what he was leaving behind? Did he realize that his private conversations with himself would echo through eternity? Probably not. His final entries suggest a man at peace with his mortality, but still focused on immediate practical concerns. He couldn't have imagined that 2,000 years later, his words would be quoted in boardrooms and therapy sessions. But that's why his wisdom endures. Marcus didn't write for eternity. He wrote for Tuesday morning. He didn't craft universal principles. He solved immediate problems. He created something more valuable than any intentional masterpiece, an honest record of how human greatness is actually achieved, not through grand gestures, but through daily practice. The discipline of thinking clearly when thinking clearly is the hardest thing in the world. The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts, he wrote, not as an abstraction, but as a practical tool for survival. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one, he reminded himself, as marching orders for the next day's battles. The emperor who felt powerless discovered the ultimate form of power, the ability to transform suffering into wisdom and wisdom into service. So here we are, still learning from Marcus Aurelius's secret journals. But there's one more twist, one final connection. Remember Epictetus, the slave who taught the emperor. Epictetus was the most influential Stoic philosopher of the period, and we know he had considerable influence over Marcus. But Marcus was never his pupil. He learned from Epictetus through his writings, just like we learn from Marcus through his. Think about the beautiful symmetry. A slave teaches an emperor. The emperor's private thoughts teach the world. Wisdom flows not through hierarchies of power, but through chains of authentic connection. Epictetus, who owned nothing, gave Marcus everything he needed to handle absolute power with integrity. Marcus, who could have commanded the worship of millions, chose instead to serve them through honest self-examination. Both men discovered that true authority comes not from controlling others, but from mastering yourself. Which brings us to you. What if you spent just 10 minutes each day having the kind of philosophical conversation with yourself that Marcus had in his tent beside the Danube? Your private growth might become someone else's public treasure. Your personal journey towards wisdom might become a roadmap for someone you'll never meet. That's how wisdom works. But that's a story for another day. Next time, we'll explore the extraordinary life of Epictetus himself, the man who shaped Marcus Aurelius's mind from beyond the grave. Born in chains, he became the freest man in Rome. Coming next, Epictetus, the slave who taught emperors how to be free. Because sometimes the most powerful wisdom comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the people with nothing to lose have everything to teach.